Good morning. My name is Nathalie Sinclair, and I'm a professor in math education at Simon Fraser University in British Columbia. I feel honored and lucky to be able to live and work on the Coast Salish territories, which are unceded lands here in British Columbia. I'm going to begin by sharing my screen with you. So here is my PowerPoint. I wanted to be able to show the full title of this roundtable, which is very complex: Research in Mathematics Education, Technological, Socio-Cultural, Historical, Philosophical, and Political Educational Aspects in Times of Pandemic, focusing on promoting inclusions. So I'm not sure I'm going to be able to speak to all of that, but I am going to speak to the political and the technological and the philosophical and the historical in small ways here and there. But my main framing for this, given my own work on the use of technologies in math education, is going to be to consider some of those aspects of math education from the point of view of technology, and from also the point of view of the inclusive materialism, philosophical kind of framework that Elizabeth de Freitas and I have been working on. So I wanted to start by thinking of the aesthetico-political and how it might matter to our work in math education. And I wanted to do that by reminding us of some of the historical ways in which the senses have been a part of mathematical thinking. So if we go back to Diderot, a French mathematician, he opined that mathematics is the true science of the blind, because he thought that seeing was something that got in the way of mathematical rationality. So there we see a mathematics that is sense-free of the visual sense and being associated with something that might be like just to the mind without the senses, if that's possible. A little later, before, we see Plato talking about the geometer's language of motion being most ludicrous. So this is Plato talking about how the mathematical ways of referring to diagrams or objects as moving or overlapping or shearing was ludicrous. So here he's denouncing the kinesthetic sense as not being a part of what is properly mathematics. And more recently in the math education community, even in the 90s, many people, math education researchers, were saying, stop counting on your fingers. They were telling primary school teachers to tell their students that. So here we see mathematics being framed as something that doesn't use your body and specifically doesn't use your mind. Your fingers or your hands. So these are all different aesthetic, political ideas about mathematics because they control sort of what can be sensed in mathematics. So can you sense visual mathematics, or can you sense dynamic mathematics, or can you sense haptic mathematics? And that in turn is important from a political point of view because it leads to changes in what is taken to make sense in mathematics. So our ideas of what can be sensed, what is properly mathematics, and what makes sense are highly related, as Rancière argued in 2004. And Elizabeth de Freitas and I have used this idea to push on the opportunities of making sense more open to more types of learners. And this isn't just about making the same mathematics easier to learn, but it is fundamentally about changing how we see mathematics and what is taken to be proper in mathematics. So this is an old picture of a classroom where you can see that the children are all being asked to have their hands behind their back. So I wanted to use this picture because it's a reminder of this era in which children were not allowed to use their fingers or their hands in mathematics. You can see that they don't look very happy. So think about what mathematics you can do in this kind of environment. There will be a lot of focus on memorizing, on repeating, maybe even on choral chanting. But it will be it will lead to an idea of number, an idea of operations that is free from the kind of both the symbolic, but also most importantly, visual ways we have of thinking about number. And also the use of the hands. That contrasts so much with how we see the hands being used in everyday contexts around the world, whether it's by famous people like Einstein, who is obstructed here by the video of me, young people in classrooms, children and their parents outside of classrooms, elders. In all of these contexts, fingers are very important in actually doing mathematical activity. So in these contexts, we see a different idea of what it means to do mathematics and what numbers mean. Here they literally mean what it is that you do on and with your fingers. And in the work that I've been doing with touchscreen technologies, I've been trying to extend those senses so that not only do you do your counting with your fingers, you can do your counting with more than 10 fingers. And the sensory engagement is not just pointing, but touching, and therefore getting the feeling of fingers on the screen, as well as the visual, as you can see. And also something that you can't see here is the oral, so the sound of those numbers being spoken every time that you touch the screen. So this is a technology that extends the senses and therefore changes what can make sense in mathematics. So it can, this gesture, for example, of putting 3 fingers on the screen makes new sense as a cardinal number of 3. It changes how we might think of subitizing. It changes how children communicate with each other in the classroom because they have new gestures for doing mathematics. And that changing of senses changes who can do mathematics as well. So the children who might have struggled with having to learn things off by heart, memorize, and just use the one sense are now potentially able to call on their other senses as primary ways of making meaning. So this is just an example, thinking about number and fingers and touch screens as our technologies for doing mathematics. So for me, the use of technology, designing technology for mathematics education is a political act because it changes who can make sense of mathematics and what can be sensed in mathematics. So as I said, we can use and extend the senses. We can change what can be sensed in order to change what makes sense. And very importantly, we can disrupt the static, immutable, and alphanumeric major mathematics that has come to be the mathematics curriculum in most countries around the world. Static means no motion. Immutable means it never changes, no matter what your country, your culture, your language. And alphanumeric means that we do not focus on other representations of mathematics unless they're the symbolic ones. So this kind of mathematics has come to be what is taken to be sensible in mathematics. So what are other ways of thinking about mathematics, and how can technology play a part in this? So to consider that, I want to look a little bit at some of the historical mathematical considerations that are involved in producing this mathematics that is static, immutable, and alphanumeric. If we look at the different technologies that have been used across time in mathematics, even pencil and paper, we can see that, as Brian Rotman says, mathematics has been engaged in a two-way co-evolutionary traffic with machines since its inception. So why is it then that it's so easy to think about mathematical concepts without thinking about all of these machines with which they've co-evolved? And for Brian Rotman, that's because mathematics prefers to forget those machines and technologies. Mathematics desires to be sort of on its own as a mind only kind of activity that doesn't involve having to see or move or touch. And we see this repeating, and so for a diagrammatic representation of this, if we can think about on the left, that there are mathematicians, mathematics, and tools involved in the creating of mathematics. What we see happens historically is that those tools completely get occluded, and they are seen as mere scaffolds to the mathematical ideas, but not as constitutive of these mathematical ideas. So similarly, there's consequences on learning theories. So in the same way that we're excited to get rid of the tools, or thinking about the tools in mathematics, in our thinking about progressions of how learning happens, we acknowledge that there's this inactive period in which children might be using concrete tools, and maybe even iconic period where they might be using diagrams, and then symbolic. And we've decided that the symbolic is where the mathematics is. So that means we've gotten rid of all of the manipulatives, we've gotten rid of all of the pictures. Those were for the earlier phases of learning. And where we would like children to be is only with the symbolic. Having forgotten the constitutive power of the tools. So again, diagrammatically, if we can talk on the one hand about there being a learner, the mathematics, and the tools, what we see in our learning theories is an occlusion of the tool, and we only talk about the learner and the mathematics. So this could be quite different, of course, and we do have situations in which we are much better at thinking about how tools are constitutive of experience and ability. So just to take an example here, we can think about seeing the world, a person who can't see very well, having to use glasses in order to notice something in the world. So here I'm making an analogy between learner, tool, and mathematics. And if we just took this triangle of separate things, then it would be easy to say, well, the learner is deficient and can't do mathematics because the learner doesn't have her glasses. But if we instead take the learner and the glasses as one thing that are inextricably linked to each other, then all of a sudden the learner is able to see without any problem at all. So in this same sense, I'm encouraging us to think about how it is that technology and learners can be thought of as being much more imbricated one with the other. so that we don't blame the learner for not knowing, but we look at what is the learner technology infrastructure that enables success in learning. So some propositions coming out of this very short intervention, two of them. One is that it is important to recover the technologies that have been constituted of mathematical practice. This is historical work, and it's also cultural work, going to look at what are the different tools that people used. We already know about the abacus, but there are many other place-based, culturally specific tools that have been very helpful for people's development of mathematics. I think, for example, of the abacus that gets used by the Yupik, who are a First Nations group in Alaska in northern United States, and how that abacus allowed counting to develop at the same time as locating oneself in space, which gives us quite a different idea of how it is that counting relates to space and geography. And that example leads to my second proposition, is that these could be help us develop local minor mathematical practices that are more culturally relevant, that our technologies are a way of associating mathematics with certain practices and certain values that are related to the place where we do mathematics, rather than being global ideas that are the same around the world. So I leave you with this thought about technology as being a way to help us recover some historical practices, as a way to help us extend who is able to access mathematics, make mathematics sensible, and what it might mean to make mathematical sense when we have access to these different types of technologies. Thank you very much.